The footman did not know her. That was how it began, on the night of the great engagement ball at Wexley Hall, when a woman in a grey gown gone soft and shapeless with washing stood at the foot of the service stair and gave her name, and the young footman, in his bright new livery, looked at her hands before he looked at her face. Her hands were the wrong hands. They were chapped across the knuckles and yellowed at the thumb where she had scrubbed a stranger's hearth that very morning, and the boy decided with the swift certainty of the very young that no person with hands like that belonged above the stairs tonight. He told her the kitchens were the other way. He told her the family received no callers. He did not bow, because there was nothing about her to bow to, and she did not correct him, because she had learned, in 3 winters, of being no one, that correction only made the wound deeper. So she stepped back into the cold. The music came down to her through a high window. A country dance she had once led with her own husband's hand at her waist, and Beatrice stood in the dark of her own house and listened to her son's happiness through the glass. She had been the Duchess of Wexley for 26 years. She was the dowager now, which is a word that means a woman who was once the center of a house and is now a draft that moves through its corridors. What the boy at the door could not have known, what no one in that bright room could have known, was that the rags she wore were not a costume and not a poverty she had chosen. They were the careful work of another woman's hand, a slow and patient unmaking. And tonight that woman wore diamonds at the top of the stairs. That is the end of a thing, and the end explains nothing. To understand how a duchess came to stand outside her own son's betrothal in a charwoman's gown, you must go back 3 years. To the autumn the old duke died, and the rain would not stop. He had died well, which is to say he had died slowly enough to set his affairs in order, and quickly enough to be spared the indignity of a long decline. Beatrice had sat with him through the last of it, in the great bed with the carved posts, and near the end he had taken her raw, cold hand in his thin one, and told her not to be afraid. Edmund was 19. The estate was sound. There was money set by £3,000 in the funds, in her own name, a widow's portion no one could touch, and the dower house at the edge of the park was hers for her life, with its own small income and its own staff. He had thought of everything. He had always thought of everything. What he had not thought of, what no dying man thinks of, was that the cousin he had taken in out of charity would read his careful provisions not as a fortress, but as a map. Lavinia Crewe had come to Wexley a decade before, a widow of a poor branch of the family with a daughter of 7 and no fortune, and a great many opinions about how a house ought to be run. The old duke had given her rooms in the east wing and a place at the table, and an allowance that was generous and quiet, and in return she had made herself useful in the 1,000 small ways a clever woman can. She knew which tradesmen cheated and which did not. She knew the names of every tenant's children. She kept the linen accounts and the still-room, and, increasingly, the keys. Beatrice had been glad of her in those years, glad of a competent hand at her elbow, and had not noticed how slowly the keys had migrated from her own girdle to Lavinia's. The way a tide comes in over a flat beach so gradually that you are wet to the knees before you understand the sea has moved. When the Duke died, the keys were already gone, and a 19-year-old boy, drowning in grief and in the sudden enormous weight of a dukedom, looked about for someone steady, and found his cousin Lavinia standing very steady indeed. The first thing she took was the dower house. She did it gently, the way she did everything. The roof, she said, was unsound, and the repairs would be ruinous, and surely the dowager would be more comfortable in the family wing, among those who loved her, at least until the spring. Beatrice, numb with mourning, agreed. The spring came. The roof was not mentioned. By summer, her rooms in the family wing had been needed for a visiting bishop, and she had been moved again, gently, to a smaller room above the old nursery, and her income, which was supposed to come to her quarterly from the estate's man of business, came late, and then later. And then came with apologies and a column of deductions she did not understand and could not, when she asked, yet explained. She should have fought it then. She knew that now. Grief, though, is a kind of paralysis, and a woman who has been loved and protected for 26 years does not easily learn to claw, and every time she lifted her head to object, Lavinia met her with such soft concern, such tender worry for the dowager's nerves, her health, that Beatrice began to doubt the evidence of her own days. That was the cruelest part, and the most patient. Lavinia did not call her a thief or a liar. She called her tired. She called her unwell. She told Edmund in the low, confiding voice of a woman who only wants the best that his poor mother was not herself, that the loss had unsettled her, that it would be a kindness not to trouble her with the running of things. And Edmund, who loved his mother and did not want her troubled, agreed. Sate. To the household, then, the dowager became a fixture. One stepped around. The room had decided she was a sad old woman who had lost her wits with her husband. New servants came who had never seen her in her diamonds at the head of the table, who knew her only as the grey woman on the nursery stair, and they were not unkind, but they did not curtsy. And a person who is not curtsied to in her own house learns, day by day, exactly how much of her was made of other people's deference. I will tell you the thing that kept her alive in those years, because it matters to everything that came after. It was not hope, not at first. It was a habit of work. Beatrice did not know how to be idle and aggrieved, so when the income failed and the small comforts vanished, she did what her hands knew, and her hands knew a great deal. She had been a country gentleman's daughter before she was a duchess, and she could scrub a floor and dress a wound and turn a collar and make a thin soup taste of something. And so she went down among the women who still remembered her and made herself useful, and they let her, and they fed her. And they did not say to her face what they said among themselves, which was that it was a wicked shame. The dressmaker's widow in the village, Mrs. Pike, had been a Wexley housemaid 40 years before, and she remembered. She gave Beatrice work she did not need, mending and washing, and paid her in coin, and in something better than coin, which was to call her Your Grace behind a closed door, very low, so that for one moment in a long gray day, Beatrice could remember who she had been. It was Mrs. Pike who first said the word aloud, that Beatrice had not let herself think. "Stolen," Mrs. Pike said one evening, her old hands flat on the work table. "Your Grace, you have been robbed, and that woman is doing the robbing. And the whole village knows it, and not one of us can prove a farthing of it." Beatrice had gone home to her cold room above the nursery and lain awake. And somewhere in that long night the paralysis broke, and underneath it, where the grief had been, she found something harder and quieter and far more useful. She found that she was angry, not loud. She had never been loud. Angry, rather, the way a winter is angry, slow and total and patient. And she understood that night that she was not going to die a draft in someone else's corridor. She was going to find out exactly how it had been done, and then she was going to undo it. That was 18 months before the ball. It is a long time to be patient. She was very good at it. She began where the money went, because money leaves a trail, even when the person spending it is careful. And Lavinia, for all her cleverness, had grown careless with success. A woman who has stolen quietly for years and never once been challenged stops believing she can be caught. Beatrice could not see the estate's ledgers, but she could see the village, and the village sees everything. She saw that the estate's grain was being sold through a factor in the next county whose name no Wexley steward had ever used. She saw that a tenant farm that should have come back to the estate had passed instead to a Mr. Pragsh. Crewe no fixed address, who was Lavinia's brother. She saw that the man of business who was supposed to send the dowager her income had been replaced, 2 years past, by a younger man Lavinia had recommended, and that this young man dined twice a month at Wexley Hall and had recently bought himself a curricle. None of it was proof. All of it was a shape. And a shape, Beatrice had learned, is the beginning of a proof if you are willing to walk all the way around it. What she needed was a witness inside the house and a lawyer outside it. And for a long time she had neither. And then on a wet market day in the spring, she had both, though she did not yet know what the second one would come to mean to her. The lawyer she found first. His name was Mr. Grew. Good fellow, and he was old and dry, and had been the late Duke's own solicitor before Lavinia eased him out in favor of someone more amenable, and he carried a grievance about it that had not faded with the years. Beatrice went to him, not as a duchess, but as a washerwoman with a question, and watched him decide whether to throw her out, and watched him recognize her instead, and watched his dry face do something it had not done in a long time. He took her case for nothing. He told her it would be slow. He told her that what she suspected, if it were true, was not merely shabby but criminal. A systematic conversion of an estate's revenues, and the deliberate impoverishment of a dependent widow, and that to prove it they would need the estate's own books, which were locked in the muniment room at Wexley Hall behind a door whose key hung at Lavinia Crew's waist. And here the story turns on a person no one in that house ever looked at twice. The Earl of Selborne had come back to the neighborhood that spring after years abroad. Tobias had been the old Duke's closest friend, a widower these many years, a tall, grave man with a reputation for saying little and missing nothing, and he had loved Beatrice once, long ago, before she was anyone's wife, and had stepped aside without a word when the Duke of Wexley offered for her, and had married elsewhere out of duty, and gone abroad, and come home at last to find the woman he had given up living as a servant in the house that should have been her kingdom. He found it out the way the whole county had found it out, in fragments, over teacups, said with relish by people who did not know he was listening, and he went home that night and did not sleep either. He came to her in Mrs. Pike's shop, ducking under the low lintel out of the rain, his great coat dark with it, and Beatrice looked up from the seam she was turning, and her heart did a thing she thought it had forgotten how to do. He did not exclaim. He did not pity her aloud, which she could not have borne. He stood dripping in the doorway and looked at her hands, and then at her face, and, unlike the footman 3 months later, he looked at the face longer. "You are well," he said, "but—" It was not a question, and it was not quite true, and they both knew it well enough, she said. He stayed an hour. He talked of nothing, of the roads, of the weather, of a horse he had bought, and she understood that the nothing was a gift, that he was giving her the ordinary conversation of an equal, the thing she had been starved of for 3 years, and when he left he set a small parcel on the work table without a word, and ducked back out into the rain. Inside was tea. Good tea, the kind she had not tasted since the old Duke died. She wept over it like a fool. And then she drank it, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. He came back. That was the dangerous part, the part she had not planned for, and could not stop. He came back the next market day, and the one after, always with the same grave courtesy, always with some small needful thing left without comment, a packet of candles, a wedge of cheese, a book she had once said she loved. He never spoke of the wrong that had been done to her. He never offered to fix it, which would have been a different kind of insult, the insult of a man who thinks a woman cannot fix her own life. Instead, he watched her decide to fix it herself, and when she finally told him, low over the work table, what she suspected and what Mr. Goodfellow needed, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the only thing that mattered. "Then we get the books," he said. The words were level and there was no doubt in them at all. "We," Beatrice noticed. She did not correct it. If you have ever watched someone you love be made small by people too comfortable to know they are cruel, you will understand the weight of what came next, and why it had to come slowly. She had been 3 years learning patience. She had one night left to spend it. The witness inside the house came to them by Lavinia's own hand, which is the truest justice of all, that the patient woman's cruelty bred the instrument of her undoing. Lavinia had a lady's maid, a sharp girl named Susan, and Lavinia treated Susan the way she treated everyone beneath her, which was as furniture that could be scolded. That spring Lavinia dismissed Susan without a character, for the crime of breaking a scent bottle, turned her out with a quarter's wages docked in no letter, which in those days could mean a girl never found honest work again. Susan went down to the village, with murder in her heart, and Mrs. Pike took her in, and Mrs. Pike, who missed nothing, sat the girl by the fire, and let her rage, and then said gently that there was a lady who might be glad of what Susan knew. Susan knew a great deal. She knew that Mrs. Crewe kept a second set of books, bound in green, in the muniment room, separate from the ones the master ever saw. She knew the muniment key hung on the housekeeper's ring, which hung in the still room overnight, because Lavinia trusted no one to keep it, and so kept it nowhere clever. She knew the night the house would be at its emptiest and its most distracted, when every servant would be run off their feet, and no one would be counting keys. She knew it because the whole county knew it. It was the night of the engagement ball, for the great prize had come at last. The prize Lavinia had spent 10 years building toward. She had got her daughter engaged to the Duke. Arabella Crewe was 17 now, pretty and pliant and trained from the cradle by her mother, to be exactly the wife a young grieving Duke might reach for. Soft-spoken and undemanding, and always there. Edmund was 22 and lonely and had grown up with a girl in the house, and Lavinia had managed the thing as patiently as she managed everything else, and now it was done. And the whole county was invited to Wexley Hall to watch the Duke of Wexley plight himself to the penniless cousin who had been raised in his halls. For Lavinia it was the final lock-turning. A daughter who was Duchess of Wexley could never be dislodged. The theft would become a dynasty. She thought. She had thought of everything. She had her brother's farm and her tame men of business, and her secret second book and her docile daughter and her diamonds, which had been the old Duchess's diamonds, which she now wore as if they had grown on her. What she had not thought of, what such people never think of, was that the woman she had spent 3 years teaching to be invisible had been using the invisibility to learn the whole house by heart. The plan was simple, which is why it could work. On the night of the ball, while the family wing emptied into the great rooms and the servants ran themselves ragged, Susan, who still had friends below stairs, would slip into the still room and lift the muniment key. Mr. Preda, Goodfellow, would be waiting in the village with a fast horse and a clerk, and the authority to copy the green ledger. Set beside the estate's true books, would speak for itself in a language no court could mistake. Tobias would see Beatrice safely there and safely back, and by morning, the proof would exist in 3 hands beyond Lavinia's reach, and the slow gray figure on the nursery stair would have her teeth at last. Beatrice did not need to go herself. Goodfellow begged her not to. Tobias, who never begged for anything, came as near to it as his nature allowed, standing in the lamplight of Mrs. M.A. Pike's back room with his hat in his hands, and said that the risk was hers and the gain could be had without it, that she need not set foot in that house and stand among the people who had unmade her. She heard him out. Then she said the thing she had been 3 years learning how to say. "It is my house," she said. "I will walk into it." And she did. Not by the front, though, and not in silk. She went the way the servants went in the gray washing gown that was her armor now, because the surest way into a house full of people who have decided you are no one is to look exactly like the no one they expect. She would be one more drudge brought in for the night's labor, invisible in the very way they had made her. And she would stand in her own muniment room while a lawyer copied the proof of her ruin. And then she would decide, when the moment came, whether to remain a ghost or to become a duchess again in front of every soul who had let it happen. So we come back to the footman who did not know her, and the country dance falling down through the high window, and Beatrice in the dark. She did not argue with the boy. She went around. The kitchen court was a riot of light and shouting, spits turning and trays flying, and no one looked twice at one more drudge in a washing gown. And she walked through it the way she had walked through. 3 years of being unseen, and being unseen carried her like a tide. Up the back stair she had climbed 10,000 times, along the cold passage past the nursery where her son had once slept, to the muniment room door. Susan was there in the shadow with the key warm in her fist. The lock gave. The green ledger was exactly where the girl had said, "Mr. Passon." Goodfellow's clerk worked fast by the light of a single shaded candle, his pen scratching. Page after page, the columns of a long, quiet crime laid open. Beatrice stood at the window, with her back to the room, and watched the lanterns of the carriages in the drive and listened to the music. And Tobias stood beside her in the dark, not touching her, his shoulder a hand's breadth from her shoulder, and the warmth of him there was the warmest thing in that cold room. It was while the clerk worked that she heard the voices in the gallery beyond the inner door. The muniment room had a second door, a jib door, papered to match the wall, that opened onto the long gallery, and the gallery ran above the great hall where the ball was held, and on this night it was being used as a retiring place for ladies, and 2 ladies had come up into it to be private. And Beatrice, frozen at the window, recognized both voices at once. One was Lavinia, the other was Arabella, the bride. What she heard then was the truth, the whole of it, said aloud at last. In the one place she could not have arranged to be, and could not now leave. She had come to steal the proof in ink. The proof in voices was a gift she had not dared to pray for. "You will not weaken now," Lavinia was saying, low and hard. The soft concern all gone out of her voice, and Beatrice understood that this, the iron, was the true voice, and the softness had always been the costume. "We did not come this far for you to lose your nerve at the gate. He is a fool and a kind one. And you will be kind back, and in a year there will be a child. And after that, it will not matter what anyone learns." "That is the old Duchess," Arabella said, and her voice was not soft now either. It was frightened.
"Mother, she is in the village. People talk."
"If it ever came out what we did to her income, what you did with the dower house, with the Selborne farm, the grain accounts, if Edmund ever saw the Green Book—" "He will not see it," Lavinia said. "No one will see it. And if that grey beggar ever opens her mouth, who do you imagine will be believed? A duchess in her own diamonds, or a mad woman who washes shirts for pennies because she has lost her wits? I built that. I built every brick of how they see her. It took me 3 years, and it will hold for 30. She is nothing now. I made her nothing. Smile and go down and marry your duke and forget she was ever a person." In the muniment room the clerk's pen had stopped. Goodfellow stood very still. Tobias had gone rigid beside her, and in the candlelight Beatrice saw his jaw set hard as carved stone, and his hand close slowly into a fist at his side, and she understood that he was holding himself by main force from going through that papered door. She put her chapped hand flat against his sleeve, just for a moment, and he stilled, because she had heard the thing she came for. Not the copied accounts only. The confession. I made her nothing, the woman had said in her own voice, with her own daughter, as her witness in the old Duchess's own house. And something in Beatrice that had been folded small for 3 years stood up to its full height and did not stoop again. She did not burst through the jib door. That was not her way. And it was not the calibrated thing. And the calibrated thing was what she had walked all this distance to do. She waited until the gallery was empty again, until Arabella's slippers had gone whispering down the stair, and Lavinia's after them. She waited until the clerk had finished and the Green Book lay copied in full, and Goodfellow had stowed the pages against his chest, like a man carrying a live coal. Then she turned from the window. "I am going down," she said. Goodfellow began to protest. Tobias did not. Tobias looked at her in the candlelight for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face made him close his mouth on the warning, and instead he offered her his arm, which was the single most extraordinary thing that had happened to Beatrice in 3 years. That a man should offer his arm to a washerwoman in a grey gown as though she were the first lady of the county, which she was. "I will go down with you," he said, his voice level. "On my arm, as you are." "As I am," she said. They went down the great stair together into the full blaze of the ball, the Earl of Selborne in his dark evening coat, and the woman in grey on his arm, and a thing happened in that room that Beatrice would remember to the end of her life. The music did not stop all at once. It frayed. A fiddle faltered, then a second, Then the dancers near the foot of the stair turned to see what the musicians had seen, and the turning spread across the floor like wind across a field of barley, head after head, until the whole bright room had gone still and silent, and was staring at the impossible sight of the cracked old beggar from the village, coming down the Duke's own staircase on the arm of an earl. Beatrice saw Edmund first. Her son stood near the great fireplace with Arabella's hand on his arm, and his young face had gone white, and she watched him not know her for one terrible heartbeat, and then know her watched. 3 years of his cousin's careful lies fight in his eyes against the plain fact of his own mother's face, and she held his gaze and did not speak. Because the next voice in that room must not be hers. It was Lavinia's. She came forward out of the crowd, and her stolen diamonds with her social armor snapped back into place. All soft, horrified concern, exactly as she had done 100 times. "Oh, the poor creature," Lavinia said, loud and warm and grieving. To the whole listening room she has wandered up from the village again in her confusion. "It is so very sad. Someone fetch the steward. She must be taken home before she frightens herself." It was the 3rd time. Beatrice had heard the lie said softly in private when it was first built, and said in the gallery just now in its true iron. And here it was a 3rd time, in its public costume in front of everyone, and the rule of 3 was complete, and the breaking of it belonged to someone else. It was Edmund who broke it. Not with a speech. He crossed the floor. Through the parted silent crowd, the young Duke of Wexley walked the long length of his own great hall, away from his bride and her mother, and stopped in front of the gray woman at the foot of the stair, and looked at her, and the whole room held its breath. And then he did the thing that undid 3 years in a single motion. He bowed, low and full. The bow a son gives his mother and a subject gives his sovereign. The bow she had not been given in that house since the night her husband died. Then he straightened, and he spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it carried into every corner of the silent room. And he said the 4 words that ended it. "Mother, you are home." That was all. He did not denounce Lavinia from the floor. He did not need to. He turned, with his mother's chapped hand drawn through his arm, and he looked at his cousin Lavinia, across the ruin of her own triumph, and into that ringing silence, Mr. Bry. Goodfellow came down the stair, with the copied pages held against his chest, and said, dry and clear, that he was the late Duke's solicitor, and that he held in his hand a true copy of certain accounts, and that he would be glad to read them aloud here and now, or quietly in the morning, as his Grace preferred. His Grace preferred the morning. He was even at 22, his father's son, and he understood that a thing done quietly cuts deeper than a thing done loud. The room, however, had heard the word accounts, and the room was no fool, and Beatrice watched the verdict change on 100 faces in the space of a breath, watched them remember 100 small cruelties they had let pass, watched the gray beggar become the wronged Duchess in their eyes between one heartbeat and the next, and she did not gloat, because she had learned that the gloat is the small soul's wage. And she had come too far to take it. Lavinia made her defense. She made it well, because she had built her whole life out of making such defenses, and a defeated antagonist is only worth defeating if she fights. She drew herself up in her diamonds, and she said, with the last of her formidable composure, that this was a cruel imposition on a grieving family, that the woman was unwell and the lawyer was a discharged servant with a grudge, that there were no irregular accounts and never had been, that she would thank them to remember who had kept this house running while a madwoman wept in the village. And for a moment, a real moment, the old machinery turned, and a few faces wavered, because she was very good and she had 3 years of careful poison on her side. It was Susan who closed the door. The dismissed lady's maid stepped out from the crowd at the foot of the stair where Mrs. Pike had quietly brought her and said plain and steady that she had served Mrs. Missis Crewe for 2 years and had carried the green ledger to the muniment room with her own hands more times than she could count, and would swear to it before any magistrate in the county. And the wavering faces stopped wavering, because the lie had needed Beatrice to be alone and unwitnessed, and she was neither. And Lavinia, who had built every brick of how the world saw the dowager, watched her construction come down in the time it takes to say one true sentence, and her polished face came apart, and for the first time in 10 years, there was nothing behind it but a frightened woman who had been caught. She was not destroyed. Beatrice would not have it so, and it was Beatrice's to decide now. And everyone in that room understood it. The accounts would be set right. The Selburne farm and the grain moneys and the dower house would come back to the estate, and what could be recovered would be recovered, and Mr. Crewe of no fixed address would be invited to explain himself to a magistrate. Lavinia, however, would not be dragged through a public trial, would not be made a spectacle, would not be ruined past mending. She would leave Wexley before noon the next day, with a small annuity that was more than she deserved and far less than she had stolen. And she would live out her years in a quiet town by the sea, corrected and displaced and quietly humbled, which is a heavier sentence than any pillory for a woman whose whole self was built of standing at the top of a staircase. And, as for the bride, Arabella was 17 and had been her mother's instrument since the cradle, and Beatrice, who had been made an instrument of no one, looked at the frightened girl and felt the anger go out of her like a tide turning. The engagement ended that night quietly, with no cruelty done to the girl in front of the county, and Arabella went with her mother to the town by the sea, and in later years, when she was a woman grown and free of the hand that had shaped her, she wrote Beatrice a letter that Beatrice answered kindly, but that is a story for another evening. The ball ended early. The carriages went out into the dark, full of people who would talk of nothing else for a 12-month. And Wexley Hall grew quiet, and Beatrice stood at last in the great hall of her own house, with her son on one side of her and Tobias on the other, and the firelight on the old portraits of all the Wexleys who had stood here before her. Edmund wept, and was not ashamed to. He begged her forgiveness for 3 years of believing a careful lie, and she gave it freely, because he had been 19 and drowning, and she could not hold the boy's grief against a grown man's apology, and she held her son's head against her shoulder the way she had when he was small with her worn hand in his hair, and forgave him before he had finished asking. The dower house was made good before the first snow. Its roof had never been unsound, of course, which everyone now understood, and Beatrice moved back into it with her £3,000 restored, and her quarterly income paid in full, and a young footman to open her door. A different footman, who had been told exactly whose door it was, and who bowed so low and so often in those first weeks that she had to gently tell him once was enough. She did not move back alone, in the end, though that took a little longer. Tobias came to her in the new year, in the dower house parlor, with the fire lit and the snow coming down past the windows in the blue winter dusk. He had courted her all those weeks the way he did everything, with grave patience and no fanfare, with small needful things left without comment until she had stopped being afraid of the warmth of him. And on this evening he set down his cup and looked at her across the small bright room and did not make a speech, because he was not a man who made speeches, and she would not have believed one if he had. "I gave you up once," he said, his voice low and level. "I was young, and I thought it was the honorable thing. I have had a long time to learn that there is no honor in being silent about the truest thing you know." He paused, and the fire shifted, and he said the rest, very simply. "I have loved you since before either of us had gray in our hair. Beatrice, I would be glad to spend what comes in the same house as you, if you would have me." She did not answer at once. She was a woman who had learned the worth of silence, and she let the silence hold the words up to the light. Then she crossed the small room, which was a thing she could do now in her own house, and she put her chapped hand against his jaw that was set like carved stone, and was not cold at all, and she felt at ease under her palm, and that was her answer, and he understood it, the way he had always understood her, without a word needing to be said. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the village church, with Mrs. Pike in the front pew weeping into a good handkerchief, and Edmund giving his mother away, and old Mr. Goodfellow standing very dry and very pleased at the back. There were no diamonds. Beatrice had not asked for the diamonds back, had let them go to the sea with the woman who had stolen them because she had discovered she did not need them to know who she was. She was married in a gown of soft green that Mrs. Pike had made with her own hands, and she had never, in her life, not even on the day she became a duchess, felt so entirely herself. The smallest images carry the most, once the large ones have been spent. It was the autumn after the wedding, a year almost to the day, from the night of the ball, and Beatrice sat in the window of the dower house parlor with Tobias, reading in the chair across from her, and the golden afternoon light coming low across the park. On the work table beside her, where another woman might have kept a jewel case, sat the small gray washing gown mended and folded that she had worn the night she walked back into her own house. She had not been able to throw it away. Tobias had asked her once gently why she kept the thing that had been the badge of her unmaking, and she had thought about it for a long while before she answered. "Because I was not nothing in it," she had said at last. "I was most myself in it. It only took them all a little while to see." The light moved across the folded gray cloth and across her hands, which were softer now but still bore, at the thumb, the faint yellow mark that no cream would ever quite take out. And she did not mind it, because it was the mark of the years she had survived, and the work that had kept her alive. And she had decided long ago to wear her history where she could see it. Outside, the bare beginning of autumn was on the trees, and the rooks were going home across the gray-gold sky. And somewhere up at the great house, her son was learning to be the man his father had been. And the fire was warm, and she was home. If Beatrice's quiet courage moved you, stay a moment at the end and remember the one she was for 3 long years. The gray woman no one would look at, and how she was the same woman all along. The world is slow to see such things. Yet it sees them at last,